Okay, next we're going to talk about the LFO. Now, there are two LFOs, but they are identical. So going through one LFO will cover the two LFOs. However, there are going to be two LFO videos because there's the LFO and then there is the function that has to do with loading and creating your own waves, which we'll talk about in a separate video. Anyway, the LFO is largely something that is not connected to anything without a connection being made. So for us to actually examine the LFO, we have to first go over to the patch panel, which we just covered. Go over to the LFO, and I'm going to do the thing that is less fun but more effective, where I just direct the LFO to the pitch. That way we can really visualize what the LFO's wave is doing to, for example, the frequency. If we do it to the filter, which always sounds better, it's more subtle. This is very overt. When we hear variations in pitch, we can imagine the shape of the wave making those variations way more easily than we can some other function, even one that sounds more fun. Anyway, so I have directed LFO1 to control the frequency of both oscillators. And the first thing we'll undoubtedly want to do, and you can tell it's LFO1 because number one, we are set to LFO1. We have this nice system here indicating which LFO we're currently set to. We're set to LFO1, and of course over in the patch section we have LFO, the patch between LFO1 and the frequency of oscillators 1 and 2. So the first thing we would want to control is the frequency of this variation, this cyclic waveform that is the LFO. Turning the rate knob is a great way to adjust the frequency of this modulation. This is it at its slowest, which is very slow. This is its fastest, which is very fast. And so also, you may want your LFO to be in time with your sequencing or your arpeggiation, and that is definitely something we can do. But to get that to happen, you have to activate the sync. Here next to the rate trigger button, we can see a little LED that says sync, and all you need to do to activate sync is to press the knob. And now we can see that we're not just going through random frequencies of speed. We're not just going through frequency increase or decrease. We're actually seeing note values. So you can set the LFO to note values that are associated with the tempo that the synthesizer is currently set to, that the patch is currently set to. And then you're going to have divisions that are always in time with your sequencer or your arpeggiator. So that is convenient. So then we can go over to the wave knob. We're obviously on a sine wave right now. And you can see that it says LFO wave sine. And then we'll just move through them. Triangle. Saw, and then square. We can get that a little faster. And of course, the interval between those two notes that we're hearing with the square can be set by the amount of the modulation, just in case you're worried about that. Then we have sample and hold, which is basically just random square waves, random samplings of voltage that are spewed out by the LFO. I don't know if it's actually random. Sometimes it's like a preset program of random sounding pitches, but since this is digital, it's probably random. This is my favorite LFO setting because it's a way to get random variation and have it sound natural. It's like a wave instead of the stair stepping of sample and hold, and that is slew sample and hold, which means the variation, the differences between voltages are gradual as you adjust from one to the next. If you have this on a very low setting, you can, for example, introduce variations in pitch that are very, very subtle and sound great, sound more analog. Here we have the exponential saw, which is the shape of the saw. Instead of it just being a straight, decrease from the highest point to the lowest point, it is an exponential curve. My understanding is that this is unipolar. It's only a positive wave. It doesn't dip below zero. And here's the opposite, a ramp that also fits all the criteria I just described, but inverted. And then we have the shaper, which is something we are going to cover in the next video. But obviously, when you have two LFOs, you have the capability of doing interesting things, which I can demonstrate. For example, let's just be weird. We've got this this unipolar exponential saw affecting the pitches of oscillators 1 and 2. Let's go in, just to be obnoxious, and let's go to LFO2 and add LFO2 to this mess. So you have the ability to create complex wave shapes, and they can be periodic like these two are at different frequencies at different amounts, and it will cause different and interesting wave shapes as this is currently doing. Or you can do, like, for example, going to the thing that I really love. Let's go back to you have a periodic waveform coupled with a random waveform, and you can get this kind of constantly changing variation that has at least some repeating element. Now you might notice how just now I played a chord, but I spaced the notes out. When you press a chord all at once, you'll notice that the modulation affects all of the notes in the same way. But if I space this out, the modulation is independent for each voice. Which, if it was not on an obnoxious noise like this, generates a huge amount of variation. If you just have a nice subtle LFO affecting something that sounds really beautiful, and then you play 3 notes, each of those notes has their own independent modulation and therefore sound very rich and full when combined. And you can make decisions about this sort of functionality by pressing Shift and turning the rate/trig knob. Retrig free means that there is no restart, and the two LFO low frequency oscillators are just running. And so when you press a note, you're just getting wherever those oscillators are at this given point, whatever they're doing, and whatever fun time that they're having on their own, irrespective of what keys you're playing. The next setting is Poly Keyboard. Poly Keyboard is each independent voice, of which there are 6, you might know, starts the LFO modulation at 0 for that note. The next time you play another note, whether that note is playing or whatever, it's next time you use another voice, it's going to start independently. And that's where we get things like the first thing I demonstrated where I played 3 different notes. Where each voice has its own modulation start point, and then it's always different than the other voices unless they started at the same time. So with mono, the LFO is going to affect all of the notes in the same way as the first notes played. So if you play 3 notes in a row, they're all going to have the same modulation and not different modulation like we just saw in the poly situation. See, they're all in tandem. That is the mono triggering style. Legato is a function where when you press a note, all subsequent notes as you hold that note have that same LFO. So it ends up being a lot like monophonic, but it helps when you're doing legato type playing. One makes basically the LFO into an envelope generator. It just goes through one single cycle of the LFO and it stops at 0. It's unipolar mostly. So then it's kind of obnoxious here using it for frequency, but it's really great for things like amplitude or filter, where you can set the amount and decide what wave and to what degree it's going to affect something. You can use it basically like a simple envelope generator. The waveform becomes an envelope, like a sawtooth wave is a specific type of waveform, and the same with a sine wave. Each of them has their own sound, and therefore you can apply the LFO as an envelope generator. So you could be using LFO1 as, some sort of vibrato thing or whatever, and then just go into LFO2 and use it as an envelope generator for pulse width or something. So that is really, really convenient. And then we have the next triggering sources are retrig LFO2 and retrig cycling envelope, and basically that means that the LFO is re-triggered by, like, for example, right now we're on LFO1. The LFO2 trig basically re-triggers the LFO1 whenever the LFO2 re-triggers. So you can get some complex waveforms that way. And the same thing with the cycling envelope, which is also an LFO in itself. When it's in its cycling mode, that would cause, for example, LFO1's LFO to re-trigger whenever the cycling envelope starts again. So you can get some really complex sounds there because maybe the cyclic envelope is being modulated by something else. So its restart is varying, and then it's not in time with the LFO's frequency. So you can get restarts, very random restarts, and super powerful functionality. Lastly, the retriggering can be started by the sequencer, which has obvious benefits. If you want your modulation to be in time with your sequence, having the LFO start with the sequence start as a retriggering is a great idea. So that is how our LFO basically works. And then we're going to talk in the next video about the waves that you can import and create with the LFO. This has been the LFOs found on the Arturia MiniFreak.